Pay attention to the bearded man in traditional clothing. His name is Nassim. He just ignited books in a metal bin, celebrating with fellow protesters. Then sudden wind extinguishes all flames despite calm weather, leaving him confused and shaken.
My name is Nassim, and on December 15th, 2018, I was a 28-year-old Muslim activist who planned to humiliate Christians by burning their holy book outside their church. That Sunday morning changed everything I believed about Jesus Christ. What happened next defied all logic and transformed my eternal destiny forever. Growing up in a devout Muslim household, I was taught from childhood that Christianity was a corrupted religion, and that Christians had deliberately changed their scriptures to mislead people. My father would sit me down every evening after prayers and explain how the true message of Jesus had been twisted by his followers. He told me that Christians worshipped 3 gods instead of one, and that they had made Jesus into something he never claimed to be. This wasn't just religious education for me. It became the foundation of my identity and my understanding of the world. My mother reinforced these teachings through her daily actions and conversations. She would point out Christian symbols in our neighborhood and shake her head disapprovingly. When we passed by churches, she would quietly recite verses from the Quran under her breath, as if to protect us from spiritual contamination. The message was clear. Christians were misguided at best and dangerous to our faith at worst. This wasn't hatred in the conventional sense, but rather a deeply ingrained belief that we were protecting the truth of Islam from those who sought to corrupt it. As I grew older, my convictions only strengthened. I attended Islamic studies classes at our local mosque, where our teacher would spend hours explaining the theological differences between Islam and Christianity. He would show us verses from the Bible that seemed to contradict each other, and then contrast them with what he called the perfect unity of the Quran. I absorbed every word, becoming more convinced that Christians were either ignorant of their own book's contradictions or deliberately deceiving others. The anger really began to build during my college years. I was studying at a university where there was a significant Christian population, and I encountered Christian students who were passionate about their faith. They would invite me to Bible studies and church events, always with smiling faces and genuine concern for my soul, but to me, their kindness felt like manipulation. I saw their evangelistic efforts as an attack on my identity and my family's honor. These weren't just theological disagreements anymore, they had become personal affronts. One particular incident stands out in my memory. A Christian classmate named David approached me in the cafeteria and asked if he could pray for me. He had noticed that I seemed stressed about upcoming exams, and he genuinely wanted to help. But I felt humiliated and insulted. In my mind, he was suggesting that my own prayers to Allah were insufficient, and that I needed his Jesus to intervene. I refused his offer politely, but the resentment burned inside me for weeks afterward. How dare he assume that his God was more powerful than mine? After graduation, I joined a local Muslim advocacy group that focused on protecting Islamic values in our community. The group was led by a charismatic imam who had studied in Pakistan and had strong opinions about the Christian missionary activities in our area. He taught us that Christians were not content to simply practice their own faith, but were actively trying to convert Muslims through deceptive means. He showed us literature from Christian organizations that specifically targeted Muslim communities, and he argued that this was a form of cultural imperialism that we needed to resist. My role in the group initially involved organizing community events and distributing educational materials about Islam. But as my commitment grew, so did my responsibilities. I began speaking at local gatherings, explaining to other Muslims why we needed to be vigilant against Christian influence. I genuinely believed that I was protecting my community from spiritual deception. The more involved I became, the more my anger toward Christians intensified, The breaking point came when a Christian family moved into the house next to ours. The father was a missionary who had returned from overseas, and he seemed determined to share his faith with everyone in the neighborhood. He would greet me warmly every morning and often tried to engage me in conversations about religion. His wife would bring homemade cookies to our door and invite my mother to neighborhood gatherings. Their children were polite and well behaved, always saying hello when they saw me, but I interpreted all of this as a calculated strategy to lower our defenses so they could eventually convert us. When the missionary father asked if he could discuss some questions he had about Islam, I agreed, thinking it would be an opportunity to show him the superiority of my faith. We had several conversations over the course of a few months, and I was frustrated by his respectful but persistent questions about Islamic teachings. He never argued aggressively, but his gentle probing made me feel like he was trying to plant seeds of doubt in my mind. The final straw came when he gave me a Bible as a gift. He said he wanted me to understand Christianity from its source rather than from second-hand descriptions. To me, this was the ultimate insult. He was essentially telling me that everything I had learned about Christianity was wrong, and that I needed to read their corrupted book to understand the truth. I accepted the Bible politely, but inside I was seething with rage. That night, I called the imam from our advocacy group and told him about the incident. He listened patiently, and then suggested that perhaps it was time for a more public demonstration of our convictions. He had been planning a protest outside one of the local churches, and he thought my experience with the missionary neighbor made me the perfect person to lead it. The idea immediately appealed to me. Instead of feeling constantly defensive, I could finally take offensive action. We began planning what we called an educational demonstration. The goal was to show the Christian community that Muslims would not be intimidated or converted by their missionary activities. We would gather outside their church during their Sunday service and make our voices heard. But as we discussed the details, the Imam suggested that we needed something more dramatic to really get their attention. He proposed that we bring copies of the Bible and publicly burn them to show that their book had no power over true believers. I want you to understand something about my mindset at that time. I genuinely believed that burning those Bibles would be an act of righteousness. In my mind, I was defending the honor of Islam and protecting other Muslims from being misled by Christian propaganda. I saw myself as a warrior for truth, standing up against what I perceived as spiritual deception. The hatred I felt wasn't just emotional, it was theological, cultural, and deeply personal all at the same time. I woke up that Sunday morning with fire in my heart and hatred in my soul. The December air was crisp, but I barely felt the cold as I dressed in my traditional white thobe and carefully wrapped my keffiyeh around my head. I wanted to look distinctly Muslim when I stood before that church. I wanted every Christian who saw me to know exactly who was challenging their faith. As I prepared for the day, I felt a sense of righteous purpose that I had never experienced before. This wasn't just a protest. This was my jihad against what I saw as spiritual deception. I had spent the previous evening collecting Bibles from various sources. Some I had purchased from a Christian bookstore, telling the clerk they were gifts for friends who were interested in Christianity. Others came from hotel rooms where I had stayed during business trips. I even had the Bible that my missionary neighbor had given me, which felt particularly symbolic. Each book represented what I believed was a lie that needed to be exposed and destroyed. I carefully placed them in a large canvas bag, handling them with disgust but also with a strange sense of anticipation. At dawn, I drove to the meeting point where the other protesters were gathering. Our group consisted of 8 men total, all from our local advocacy organization. There was Omar, a recent convert to Islam who had once been Christian and now felt betrayed by his former faith. Hassan was a taxi driver who was angry about Christian passengers who had tried to witness to him. Ahmed worked at a grocery store and complained constantly about Christian customers who left gospel tracts with their receipts. Each man had his own personal grievances against Christianity, and together we formed what I believed was a righteous army. Our Imam had spent weeks preparing us for this moment. He reminded us that we were not just representing ourselves, but the entire Muslim community. He emphasized that our actions needed to be peaceful but firm, dramatic but controlled. We had obtained the proper permits for our demonstration, and we understood the legal boundaries we needed to respect. But within those boundaries, we intended to send an unmistakable message about the power and truth of Islam. As we drove towards St. Matthew's Church, I reviewed our strategy one final time. We would arrive early and position ourselves strategically around the main entrance to the church building. Our signs were carefully crafted to communicate our message without crossing into hate speech territory. They read things like Islam is the true path and one God, not three, and Muhammad is the final prophet. We had practiced our chants and ensured that our voices would carry clearly to anyone approaching the church. St. Matthew's was a large, modern church building located on a busy street corner. The parking lot could accommodate several hundred cars, and there were multiple entrances to the building. But we knew that most congregants used the main entrance, which faced the street where we had permission to demonstrate. As we set up our position at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, I felt my heart racing with anticipation and adrenaline. The first Christians began arriving around 10:15, and I was immediately struck by how ordinary they looked. I had somehow expected them to appear different, perhaps more obviously deceptive or manipulative. Instead, I saw an elderly grandmother clutching her worn Bible and walking slowly with the help of a cane. Behind her came a young family with 3 small children, the parents trying to keep the kids organized while carrying diaper bags and church materials. These were not the dangerous missionaries I had imagined, but regular people who simply believed differently than I did. But I pushed aside any feelings of sympathy or doubt. I reminded myself that appearances could be deceiving, and that these seemingly innocent people were part of a larger system that sought to undermine Islamic truth. When the grandmother approached our line of protesters, I stepped forward and began our first chant, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger." The other men joined in immediately, and our voices echoed across the parking lot. The elderly woman paused for a moment and looked directly at me. Instead of fear or anger, I saw something in her eyes that I wasn't prepared for: sadness and compassion. She didn't argue with us or try to debate our chants. She simply nodded slightly and continued walking toward the church entrance. Her response unsettled me more than anger would have. I had expected confrontation, not pity. More churchgoers continued to arrive, and our chanting grew louder and more intense. Some people hurried past us without making eye contact, while others stopped to listen to our message. A few tried to engage us in conversation, asking questions about Islam or expressing curiosity about our beliefs, but I had been instructed to stay focused on our demonstration, rather than getting drawn into individual discussions. Around 10:30, 2 police officers arrived and approached our group. I felt my muscles tense, wondering if we were about to be arrested or forced to leave. But the officers were professional and courteous. They checked our permits, asked about our plans for the demonstration, and reminded us about the boundaries we needed to respect. They seemed more concerned about traffic flow and public safety than about our message. After a brief conversation with me as the group leader, they positioned themselves nearby to monitor the situation. As the church service time approached, I realized that our chanting and sign holding weren't having the dramatic impact I had hoped for. Most Christians were simply walking past us and entering the building without seeming particularly affected by our presence. Some even smiled and waved, which frustrated me enormously. How could they be so dismissive of our powerful message? How could they show such indifference to our passionate demonstration of Islamic truth? It was then that I decided we needed to escalate our tactics. I pulled Omar aside and reminded him about the second phase of our plan. We had brought a metal trash bin specifically for this purpose, and we had positioned it in a visible location where our actions could be clearly seen by anyone entering or leaving the church. The time had come to show these Christians that their holy book had no power and no truth. I walked back to our vehicle and retrieved the canvas bag containing the Bibles. As I carried it toward the metal bin, I felt the weight of the books and the significance of what I was about to do. My fellow protesters gathered around me, some of them filming with their phones to document this historic moment. I reached into the bag and pulled out the first Bible, the one that my missionary neighbor had given me. The irony felt perfect. Ask yourself this question: have you ever been so convinced of your own righteousness that you were willing to destroy something sacred to others? That's exactly where I stood in that moment. I was absolutely certain that what I was doing was not only justified but necessary. I believed I was striking a blow for truth against deception, for monotheism against polytheism, for the final revelation against corrupted scriptures. I held up the Bible so that anyone watching could see it clearly, then placed it carefully in the metal bin. The other protesters pressed closer, eager to witness this culminating moment of our demonstration. I pulled out my lighter, a simple disposable device that I had tested multiple times to ensure it would work reliably. My hands were steady, and my resolve was firm. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the opportunity to prove that their God had no power, and that their book was nothing more than paper and ink. But as I prepared to light that first page, I had no idea that I was about to encounter something that would challenge everything I believed about reality, about God, and about the nature of divine truth itself. I flicked the lighter and watched the small flame dance in the crisp December air. The sound was sharp and clear, and I could feel the heat against my thumb as I held it steady. My fellow protesters leaned in closer, their phones recording every moment of what we believed would be a triumphant demonstration of Islamic truth over Christian deception. I lowered the flame toward the corner of the Bible's cover, watching as the fire made contact with the binding. The pages caught immediately. Small orange flames began licking at the edges of the book, and thin wisps of smoke started rising from the metal bin. I felt a surge of satisfaction watching the fire spread across what I believed were corrupted scriptures. The other protesters began cheering and chanting Allahu Akbar as they watched the flames grow stronger. Omar was filming enthusiastically, capturing what he called our moment of victory over Christian lies. For about 30 seconds, everything proceeded exactly as I had planned. The Bible burned steadily, the flames consuming page after page of what I thought were false teachings about Jesus. I reached for a second book from my bag, ready to add fuel to the fire and make our statement even more dramatic. The smoke was visible from across the parking lot, and I noticed several churchgoers stopping to watch our demonstration. This was exactly the attention I wanted to draw to our cause. But then something happened that I still struggle to explain, even years later. The air around us suddenly changed in a way that defied every natural law I understood. There was no weather forecast calling for wind that morning. The meteorologist had predicted clear skies and calm conditions, perfect for our outdoor demonstration. Yet without any warning, a powerful gust of wind swept across the parking lot with incredible force. This wasn't a gentle breeze or even a strong wind. It felt like the air itself had been commanded to move with supernatural intensity. The force was so sudden and overwhelming that it knocked Omar backward and sent our protest signs tumbling across the asphalt. Hassan grabbed onto a nearby lamppost to steady himself, and Ahmed's keffiyeh was blown completely off his head. But most shocking of all, the wind extinguished every flame in the metal bin instantly, as if someone had thrown a bucket of water on the fire. I stared down at the Bible in disbelief. Just moments before, it had been burning steadily with bright orange flames. Now it sat in the bin, blackened around the edges but no longer on fire. Thin streams of smoke still rose from the pages, but there were no visible flames anywhere. The sudden silence was deafening after the crackling sounds of the fire and our enthusiastic chanting. My first reaction was practical confusion. I assumed this was just an unfortunate coincidence, a random weather event that had temporarily interrupted our demonstration. I flicked my lighter again, and the flame appeared just as reliably as before. The mechanism was working perfectly, producing a strong, steady fire. I lowered it back toward the Bible, confident that I could easily relight the pages and continue with our protest, but the fire wouldn't catch. I held the lighter flame directly against the charred pages, moving it slowly across different sections of the book. The lighter was burning normally, producing plenty of heat and a bright yellow flame, but no matter how long I held it against the Bible, no matter which part of the book I targeted, nothing would ignite. It was as if the pages had become fireproof in the span of those few seconds. I tried again and again, growing more frustrated with each failed attempt. The other protesters gathered around me, offering suggestions and encouragement. Omar suggested that the pages might be damp from morning dew, even though we had stored the books in a dry bag. Hassan thought maybe the wind had blown some kind of fire retardant onto the Bible, though there was no logical source for such a substance in a church parking lot. The reality of what was happening began to sink in as I continued my futile attempts to relight the fire. This wasn't a mechanical problem with my lighter. This wasn't moisture or chemicals interfering with combustion. Something far more profound and inexplicable was preventing these pages from burning, and that realization filled me with a growing sense of unease that I had never experienced before. I pulled out a second Bible from my bag, thinking that perhaps there was something unique about the first book that was preventing it from catching fire. But when I tried to light the fresh Bible, the same thing happened. The lighter flame was strong and hot, but the pages simply would not ignite. It was as if I was trying to light metal or stone instead of paper. As I stood there with my lighter in hand, repeatedly failing to accomplish what should have been the simplest task imaginable, I began to feel a strange sensation throughout my entire body. It started as a tingling in my fingertips and quickly spread up my arms and into my chest. My heart began beating faster, but not from the adrenaline of protest or the frustration of technical difficulties. This was something else entirely, something that felt like my very soul was responding to a presence I couldn't see or identify. The wind that had extinguished our fire was long gone, but the air around me still felt different somehow. It was as if the atmosphere itself had become charged with an invisible energy that I could sense, but not explain. My fellow protesters were talking excitedly among themselves, trying to figure out what had gone wrong with our demonstration, but their voices seemed to fade into the background as this overwhelming sensation continued to build within me. I want you to understand that I had never experienced anything like this before in my life. I had always been a rational, practical person who could find logical explanations for unusual events. I didn't believe in supernatural experiences or mystical encounters. My Islamic faith was intellectual and theological, based on careful study of scripture and adherence to established practices. But what was happening to me in that parking lot transcended anything my rational mind could process or explain. The sensation continued to intensify until it felt like every cell in my body was vibrating with an energy that wasn't my own. My hands began to tremble uncontrollably, and I nearly dropped the lighter as waves of something I can only describe as overwhelming peace began washing over me. But this wasn't the peace of successful meditation or the satisfaction of accomplished goals. This was a peace that seemed to come from outside of myself, flowing into me from a source I couldn't identify. My legs began to feel weak beneath me, as if my own physical strength was being drained away and replaced with something entirely different. I tried to maintain my composure in front of the other protesters, but I could feel my body betraying me as this inexplicable experience continued to unfold. The metal bin with the unburned Bibles seemed to blur in my vision, and I realized that tears were streaming down my face without my permission or understanding. The other protesters were beginning to notice my strange behavior. Omar stopped filming and asked if I was feeling sick. Hassan suggested that maybe I had inhaled too much smoke from the brief fire, but I couldn't form words to respond to their questions. Something was happening to me that went far beyond physical illness or emotional reaction, and I was powerless to stop it or control it. That's when I heard it, or rather felt it, because it wasn't an audible voice in any conventional sense. It was more like thoughts that weren't my own appearing in my mind with absolute clarity and unmistakable authority. The message was simple but earth-shattering. I am here, and I love you. These weren't words I would have ever expected to hear, especially not in that moment, and certainly not from the source I somehow knew they were coming from. The voice that spoke into my heart carried a quality I had never encountered before in my life. It wasn't the stern, distant voice of Allah that I had been taught to expect during prayers. This presence felt intimately personal, as if someone who knew every detail of my thoughts and motivations was speaking directly to my soul. The love in that voice was so overwhelming that my entire understanding of divine interaction began to crumble in that single moment. I couldn't control what was happening to my body. The trembling in my hands had spread throughout my entire frame, and I felt my knees beginning to buckle beneath me. It was as if my physical strength was being deliberately removed, not as punishment but as invitation. The sensation reminded me of a child being gently guided to sit down, except this was happening to my entire spiritual being rather than just my body. My legs finally gave out completely, and I found myself kneeling on the cold asphalt of the church parking lot. The concrete scraped against my knees through my traditional clothing, but the physical discomfort seemed insignificant compared to what was happening in my heart. I had knelt for prayers thousands of times in my life, but this was different. I wasn't choosing to kneel. Something greater than myself was drawing me into a posture of surrender that I had never experienced before. The tears continued flowing down my cheeks, and I realized that I was weeping for reasons I couldn't articulate or understand. These weren't tears of frustration over our failed demonstration or embarrassment at my sudden weakness in front of the other protesters. This was a deep, soul-level response to encountering something that my Islamic worldview had never prepared me for. I was face to face with a presence that felt both completely foreign and strangely familiar at the same time. As I knelt there on the asphalt, struggling to comprehend what was happening to me, the voice in my heart spoke again with even greater clarity. Nasim, I have been calling you for years. The use of my name sent shockwaves through my entire being. This wasn't a general spiritual experience or a psychological breakdown. This was personal, specific, and undeniably real. Someone who knew me intimately was communicating with me in a way that bypassed my rational mind and spoke directly to the deepest parts of my identity. I tried to respond using the Arabic prayers I had memorized since childhood, but the words felt hollow and mechanical compared to this direct, intimate communication. For the first time in my life, formal religious language seemed inadequate to express what my heart was experiencing. Instead of reciting memorized verses, I found myself thinking simple, honest thoughts directed toward this mysterious presence. Who are you? What do you want from me? The answer came immediately, flooding my consciousness with such intensity that I gasped audibly. I am Jesus, and I want you to know He is my love. Those words shattered every theological foundation I had built my life upon. According to everything I had been taught, Jesus was just a prophet, a good man who had been wrongly elevated to divine status by his misguided followers. The idea that he could be personally present and communicating with me was not just impossible but blasphemous according to my Islamic understanding. Yet I couldn't deny what I was experiencing. This presence was more real than anything I had ever encountered in years of Islamic prayers and meditation. The love radiating from this voice was so pure and powerful that it made every other experience of affection in my life pale by comparison. This wasn't human love with conditions and limitations. This was divine love that seemed to see every ugly thought I had ever harbored, every hateful action I had ever taken, and love me completely despite it all. The other protesters were becoming increasingly agitated by my behavior. I could hear Omar's voice calling my name urgently, asking what was wrong with me. Hassan was suggesting that we should pack up and leave before the police became concerned about my condition. Ahmed was worried that I was having some kind of medical emergency, but their voices seemed to be coming from very far away, as if I was hearing them through thick glass or from underwater. I couldn't explain to them that I was having the most important conversation of my life with someone they couldn't see or hear. How could I tell these devout Muslims that Jesus Christ himself was speaking to my heart and inviting me into a relationship I had spent my entire life rejecting? How could I describe the overwhelming sense of coming home to a place I had never been before? The presence continued to communicate with me, and each exchange deepened my understanding of how wrong I had been about Christianity. The voice explained with infinite patience that my anger and hatred had been misdirected, that the Christians I had opposed were actually his beloved children trying to share his love with others. The missionary neighbor who had frustrated me so deeply was simply following Jesus' command to love his neighbors. The Bible I had just tried to burn contained his words of life and hope for anyone willing to receive them, but what struck me most powerfully was the complete absence of condemnation in this divine communication. I had come to this parking lot to publicly humiliate and attack Christianity. I had brought Bibles specifically to burn them in front of Christian worshippers. I had organized other Muslims to join me in what was essentially a hate demonstration against their faith. Yet this presence that identified itself as Jesus showed no anger toward me, only incredible sadness for the years I had spent running away from his love. I began to understand that every Christian who had tried to witness to me over the years had been sent by this same loving presence. Every invitation to Bible study, every offer to pray for me, every gift of Christian literature had been Jesus himself trying to reach me through his people. My interpretation of these gestures as attacks or manipulations had been completely backwards. They were actually expressions of divine love trying to break through my walls of religious prejudice and cultural conditioning. The weight of this realization was almost unbearable. I thought about all the opportunities I had rejected to learn about Christianity from a genuine perspective. I remembered the countless times I had dismissed Christian kindness as deception or strategy. I recalled the anger I had felt when Christians claimed that Jesus was the Son of God, not realizing that I was rejecting the very person who was now revealing himself to me with such tender mercy. As these thoughts raced through my mind, I felt an overwhelming urge to respond to this incredible offer of love and forgiveness. Despite everything I had done wrong, despite the hatred I had carried in my heart, despite the very act I was in the middle of committing against his people, Jesus was still extending his hand toward me in invitation rather than judgment. The choice was mine to make, and I knew that this moment would determine not just my immediate future, but my eternal destiny. Ask yourself this question: when divine love confronts your deepest prejudices and longest held beliefs, how do you respond? Do you cling to familiar hatred, or do you open your heart to transformative truth? That was the crossroads where I found myself kneeling on that December morning, faced with the most important decision any human being can ever make. I couldn't form eloquent theological arguments or sophisticated religious responses. All I could manage was a simple, desperate plea from the deepest part of my heart. Jesus, if this is really you, please help me. I don't understand what's happening, but I don't want to fight against you anymore. If you're real, I need you to save me from myself. The moment I spoke those words of surrender, something extraordinary happened within me that I can only describe as being born again from the inside out. It was as if a heavy burden I had carried my entire life was suddenly lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a lightness and peace that defied all logical explanation. The hatred that had consumed my thoughts for years simply evaporated, leaving behind a profound sense of freedom I had never imagined possible. I slowly stood up from the asphalt, my legs still shaking, but somehow stronger than they had been moments before. My fellow protesters were staring at me with expressions of confusion and growing alarm. The tears were still streaming down my face, but they were no longer tears of confusion or fear. They had become tears of overwhelming gratitude for an encounter that had completely changed my understanding of reality and my place in the universe. Without thinking about the consequences or considering what my actions might look like to others, I began walking away from the metal bin containing the unburned Bibles. Each step felt like I was walking away from my old life and towards something entirely new and unknown. The other protesters called after me, demanding to know where I was going and what was wrong with me, but I couldn't find words to explain what had just happened. How could I tell them that Jesus Christ himself had spoken to my heart and invited me to follow him? I walked directly toward the main entrance of St. Matthew's Church, the very building I had come to oppose and disrupt. The irony was overwhelming. Less than an hour earlier, I had positioned myself to block Christians from entering their place of worship. Now I was walking toward that same entrance, drawn by an invisible force that felt like divine magnetism pulling me towards something I had spent my entire life rejecting. As I approached the church doors, I saw the pastor standing near the entrance greeting late arrivals. He was an older man with graying hair and kind eyes, wearing a simple black suit and white collar. When he noticed me walking toward him with tears still visible on my face, he stepped forward with obvious concern, rather than the fear or suspicion I might have expected given the nature of our demonstration outside his church. He extended his hand toward me and spoke with genuine warmth in his voice. "Son, are you all right? You look like you've been through something difficult." His kindness was so unexpected and overwhelming that it triggered a fresh wave of tears. Here was a Christian minister showing immediate concern for the very person who had organized a protest against his congregation and tried to burn their holy book just moments earlier. I struggled to find words to respond to his question. How could I explain that I had just encountered Jesus Christ in the parking lot while attempting to publicly humiliate his followers? How could I describe the complete transformation that had taken place in my heart in the span of a few minutes? Finally, I managed to speak through my tears. "Pastor, I came here this morning to burn your Bibles and mock your God, but something incredible just happened to me out there." Instead of recoiling in shock or calling for security, the pastor's face lit up with understanding and joy. He placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and said words that I will never forget. "God brought you here for a reason, son. You're not here by accident, and you're certainly welcome in his house." His response revealed a spiritual maturity and wisdom that I had never encountered before. Rather than focusing on what I had intended to do, he was celebrating what God was actually doing in my life at that very moment. The pastor invited me to step inside the church building, away from the chaos and confusion of the continuing protest outside. As we walked through the entrance doors, I looked back and saw my former fellow protesters gathered around the metal bin, arguing among themselves about what had happened to me and whether they should continue with the demonstration or pack up and leave. Omar was gesticulating wildly, clearly frustrated by my abandonment of our cause. Hassan was shaking his head in disgust, probably feeling betrayed by what he saw as my sudden weakness or possible mental breakdown. Inside the church, the atmosphere was completely different from what I had expected. The sanctuary was filled with ordinary people of all ages, singing worship songs with genuine joy and enthusiasm. Families sat together in the pews, children quietly coloring in activity books, while their parents participated in the service. Elderly couples held hands as they sang, their faces radiating peace and contentment. This wasn't the gathering of deceptive religious manipulators I had imagined. These were sincere people, expressing authentic faith in a God who had just revealed himself to me in the most dramatic way possible. The pastor led me to a quiet corner of the lobby where we could talk privately without disrupting the ongoing service. He asked me to tell him exactly what had happened in the parking lot, and I found myself sharing details I had never expected to speak aloud. I described the failed attempts to burn the Bibles, the inexplicable wind that had extinguished our fire, the overwhelming presence I had encountered, and the voice that had identified itself as Jesus Christ. As I recounted my experience, the pastor listened with complete attention and obvious belief in what I was telling him. He didn't question the supernatural elements of my story or suggest that I might have been experiencing a psychological episode. Instead, he nodded knowingly and said, "Son, what you've experienced today is what we call the divine call of Jesus Christ. He's been pursuing you for years, and today, he finally got your attention." The pastor then asked me a question that cut straight to the heart of my new reality. "Now that you've encountered Jesus personally, what do you want to do about it?" The weight of that question was enormous. I realized that I was standing at a crossroads that would determine not just my immediate future, but the entire trajectory of my life from that moment forward. I thought about my family, who would be devastated by any suggestion that I was abandoning Islam. I considered my community, who would view any conversion to Christianity as the ultimate betrayal of everything they held sacred. I reflected on my identity, which had been built entirely around being a devout Muslim and defender of Islamic truth. Everything I had understood about myself and my place in the world was suddenly in question. But as I weighed these concerns against the reality of what I had just experienced, there was no real choice to be made. I had encountered the living God in a way that transcended all theological arguments and cultural expectations. Jesus Christ had revealed himself to me with such power and love that rejecting his invitation would have been like rejecting life itself. Looking directly into the pastor's eyes, I spoke words that would change everything. "I want to follow Jesus. I don't understand all the implications, and I'm terrified of what this means for my family and community. But I can't deny what just happened to me out there. If Jesus is real, and if he really loves me the way I felt in that moment, then I want to give my life to him completely." The pastor smiled with tears in his own eyes and asked if I would like to pray with him right there in the church lobby. I nodded, and he began leading me in what he called the sinner's prayer. As I repeated the words after him, asking Jesus to forgive my sins and become the Lord of my life, I felt that same overwhelming peace that had first drawn me to my knees in the parking lot. But this time, the peace was accompanied by an unshakable certainty that I was finally home. Now ask yourself this question. When God calls you to abandon everything familiar and step into an unknown future, do you have the courage to say yes? That morning taught me that the most important decisions in life often require us to choose faith over fear, truth over comfort, and divine love over human approval. The first week of my new life as a Christian was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I spent hours each day reading the very Bible I had tried to burn just days earlier, and every page revealed truths that resonated with the encounter I had experienced in that church parking lot. The words of Jesus in the Gospels felt alive and personal, as if he was continuing the conversation we had started when I was kneeling on that asphalt. I couldn't put the book down, reading late into the night and waking up early to continue studying. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now treasuring the same book I had collected specifically to destroy. The Bible my missionary neighbor had given me, which I had carried to the church with such hatred, now sat on my nightstand as the most precious possession I owned. Every verse I read seemed to speak directly to my situation, explaining the transformation I had experienced and guiding me toward understanding my new identity as a follower of Christ. But my newfound joy was quickly overshadowed by the reality of what my conversion meant for my relationships with family and community. When I finally gathered the courage to tell my parents what had happened, their reactions were even more devastating than I had anticipated. My father's face went completely white when I explained that I had given my life to Jesus Christ. For several minutes he sat in stunned silence, staring at me as if I had become a stranger in his own home. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a pain I had never heard before. "You are no longer my son. The boy I raised would never abandon his faith and his family for the lies of Christianity." Those words cut deeper than any physical wound could have. My father, who had been my hero and role model throughout my childhood, was disowning me completely. The finality in his voice made it clear that this wasn't an emotional reaction that would fade with time. He was making a permanent decision to sever our relationship. My mother's response was even more heartbreaking. She collapsed into uncontrollable sobbing, wailing as if I had died rather than simply changed religions. Through her tears, she kept repeating, "Where did we go wrong? How did we fail you so completely?" Her anguish was genuine and overwhelming, and watching her pain made me question for the first time whether the cost of following Jesus might be too high to bear. The news of my conversion spread through our Muslim community like wildfire. Within days, I was receiving angry phone calls from relatives, former friends, and community leaders who demanded that I reconsider my decision and return to Islam. The imam who had encouraged our protest outside the church was particularly harsh, suggesting that I had been brainwashed or manipulated by clever Christian missionaries who had taken advantage of a moment of weakness. The social consequences were swift and brutal. I lost my job at a Muslim-owned business when my employer learned about my conversion. Friends I had known for years stopped returning my calls and unfriended me on social media. The mosque where I had worshipped since childhood banned me from entering the building. I was suddenly an outcast in the only community I had ever known, treated as if I had committed an unforgivable crime, rather than simply following my conscience. But even as I faced rejection from my old life, something beautiful was happening in my new one. The peace I had experienced during my encounter with Jesus remained constant, providing an anchor of stability even when everything else in my world was falling apart. During my darkest moments of doubt and loneliness, I would remember the overwhelming love I had felt in that parking lot, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choice regardless of the cost. The Christian community at St. Matthew's Church embraced me with an acceptance and support that I had never experienced before. Pastor Williams spent hours with me each week, patiently answering my questions and helping me understand basic Christian doctrines. Church members invited me to their homes for meals and fellowship, treating me like a beloved family member rather than a former enemy who had once tried to disrupt their worship. 3 months after my conversion, I made the decision to be baptized publicly, marking my commitment to Christ in a way that made my transformation official and irreversible. As I stood in the baptismal pool, surrounded by my new Christian family, I thought about the journey that had brought me to that moment. The same hands that had once held a lighter to burn Bibles were now being raised in worship to Jesus Christ. The same voice that had chanted against Christianity was now declaring my faith in the very Savior I had once opposed. The day of my baptism brought unexpected hope regarding my family relationships. My mother attended the ceremony despite my father's strong objections, sitting quietly in the back of the sanctuary with tears streaming down her face. After the service, she approached me cautiously and whispered, "I don't understand what has happened to you, but I can see that you have found peace. Maybe someday you can help me understand." Her words gave me hope that complete reconciliation might eventually be possible. My father remained distant and cold, but even his hostility began to soften slightly as months passed, and he saw the genuine changes in my character and behavior. The anger and hatred that had once consumed me were completely gone, replaced by a love and compassion that extended even to those who rejected me. I began praying for my family's salvation daily, trusting that the same Jesus who had transformed my heart could work in their lives as well. As my first year as a Christian progressed, I began to sense God calling me to share my testimony with others, particularly Muslims who might be struggling with their own doubts about Islam. I started speaking at churches and Christian conferences, telling the story of how Jesus had dramatically intervened in my life and drawn me to himself, despite my passionate opposition to Christianity. The response to my testimony was overwhelming. I received hundreds of emails and letters from people whose lives had been touched by hearing about God's power to transform even the most unlikely hearts. Some were Christians who gained renewed appreciation for the grace they had received. Others were Muslims who privately admitted they had questions about their faith and wanted to learn more about Jesus. This unexpected ministry led to opportunities I never could have imagined. I began working with organizations that specialized in reaching Muslim communities with the gospel, using my background and experience to build bridges between Christianity and Islam. My former life as a Muslim activist, which had once been dedicated to opposing Christianity, was now being used by God to advance his kingdom in ways I never thought possible. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself whether you're open to the kind of radical transformation that can only come from encountering Jesus Christ personally. My story isn't unique because God chose me specifically, but because God's love is available to anyone who will receive it, regardless of their background or their past opposition to his truth. The greatest irony of my life is that I came to destroy, but was instead saved by the very God I thought I was fighting. That December morning taught me that Jesus doesn't just love Christians, he loves Muslims too, and he was calling me home to a relationship I had spent my entire life rejecting. I thank God every day for that Sunday when he stopped me from making the biggest mistake of my life, and instead gave me the greatest gift imaginable, eternal life in his Son, Jesus Christ. Today, as I share my testimony around the world, I carry with me the profound truth that no heart is too hard, no opposition too strong, and no hatred too deep for the transforming power of God's love. The same Jesus who reached down and saved me in that church parking lot is reaching toward you right now, offering the same grace, forgiveness, and eternal life to anyone who will simply say yes to his invitation.